Hi, I'm Mara Webster, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We're so fortunate today to be joined by the fantastic executive producer and director of Netflix series Halston, Daniel Minahan. And I wanted to start by talking about your treasure trove of archive and research and that storage unit that you had that was full of everything. And even down to the fact that over the years when you were trying to get this project off the ground, that you would keep buying Halston pieces if they would come on the market and become available for archival purposes. And how by the time you actually got into making this series, that archive and research trove had really become such a valuable resource, but then how you distilled down what were the useful elements that you'd collected over the years for actually making the show and going into production.
Sure. When you develop a project for 20 years, as I did this one, you can collect a lot of research materials. I had squirreled it all away into deep, deep storage and moved on in my life and my career because it was sort of a quixotic obsession for me. And secretly kept buying pieces, secretly kept clippings, books as they came out about Halston and his world. So by the time I met with Ewan McGregor, I had a lot of stuff. I distilled it down to some really sort of primal show and tell images and a couple of dresses and gowns and the big glass perfume bottle designed by Elsa Peretti. And we just had a big show and tell session. And when it came time to shoot the show, I shared all of those things with my team, my costume designer and my production designer. Both, I just gave them all access to it. And the actors would come over and we would have Sunday dinners when we were prepping, and they would just go through all of the books and all of the magazines and all the clippings. And it was a really good way of people to just absorb that world. And then I let them kind of choose what was relevant. And together we kind of put forward, what the collections would look like with Jeriana, our costume designer, and which interiors we would be exploring and how we wanted to realize them. So yeah, it was quite a process, but it was really fun.
And you mentioned there that this is a project that has been in the works with you personally, trying to bring it forth to screen for over 20 years, which is really monumental when you step back and think about what that actually means. And the original concept was actually for a movie, because miniseries as we now know them weren't the same thing back in the 90s. There was a very different perspective of a miniseries. But when you look at the final version and these episodes that you've put together so beautifully, what are the aspects of the DNA of that have always been there from the beginning, from when you first conceptualized what you wanted this to be on screen?
The absolute essential part of this story for me was always his genius as a designer, the incredible world and the milieu of his society, this little team of creative people that he put together. And then, of course, the really important idea of branding and marketing his own name. And the thing that always haunted me about this story, and the thing that I think makes it even more relevant today, is the idea of this man who is separated from his name, his identity, and they took away his ability to create. And I just think it feels very topical while people are thinking a lot about branding themselves and working really hard towards that. I think it's a little bit of a meditation on the American dream. And kind of asks, what are you willing to compromise to get what you want?
And as you were figuring him out as a character on screen, and in particular working with Ewan, one of the things that the two of you did together was watching a lot of videotapes and old interviews with him. And I thought it was fascinating the way that you've described how there would be these moments and inflections where you could see a difference in when he knew that the camera was on him, and moments where maybe he didn't realize the camera was still rolling, and how there'd be a different intonation to his voice or way that he would speak. And what are some of the details that you and Ewan really found for his performance from looking at a lot of those interviews in that way?
It's interesting because with the Halston character, his dialect and his comportment change over time. He becomes more affected. He becomes more grand in his speech, and the dialect becomes more exaggerated. And by studying those videos of him, we were able to see that. And, it was sort of, we kind of felt like it was sort of a mask that he wore. And the fun part was trying to imagine what he was like when he wasn't on camera or when he wasn't performing his persona. And that was the challenge. And I think Ewan did a beautiful, beautiful job of that. There was one video in particular that we acquired from the Warhol Foundation. That was from Andy Warhol TV. We saw it at the Brooklyn Museum where they did a big exhibit of Studio 54 memorabilia. And there were these videos running. And so we contacted them, we got the videos, and you could see, they didn't just send us the finished show, they sent us all of the footage. So Ewan got to see what he was like when he didn't realize he was on camera or when he thought the cameras were off. And that was really, really valuable.
And you mentioned there the idea of trying to construct him as a character on screen and thinking about who he is in the private moments of his life. But there's so many characters that you have to do that with. With Liza Minnelli, we're seeing the quiet moments when she's on the phone with Halston in the middle of the night. And, you know, that's an imagineering of what would that be like? What would that conversation look like? What are the personality traits that we don't get the opportunity to see? And same for Elsa Peretti. You know, we see her in the public eye and we see interviews from her, but again, mostly from later years as well. And so what was that scripting process and working with Ryan and really figuring out a lot of the minutia and the much more grounded elements of characters that we know a certain version of, but that not being the version that you were working to bring onto screen?
Yeah, Ryan and Ian, our writers, really have an incredible ear for this kind of dialogue. And, you know, we all put a lot of ourselves into this piece. And I feel like Ryan was very generous with his own experience. You know, I mean, he actually has the experience of being a gay guy from Indiana who comes to America, you know, who comes to the city and builds an empire, you know, and everything that kind of is thrown down in his way. And I feel like for all of us, it's a very personal story, because I think Halston, when you grow up as a gay kid, there are people that you look to, you know, that are like, okay, I know who that is. And, you know, maybe when I move to New York, I'll be as successful as he is, or I'll have a great life and all these friends, you know. So it was interesting. It was a very interesting process in the script. And I think they did a remarkable job. It was such a delicious, you know, there were such delicious scenes that we got to shoot every day.
And I really, really wanted to talk about the costumes, because the costumes are exquisite, and you worked to have most of them designed from scratch based on the original cuts and patterns. And even within the show, there's that great scene very early on where the camera just lingers a little bit on some women walking down the street, and then there's another person over here going into a store and shows us the rigidity and the types of fabrics and the types of styles that women were wearing, so that it can take us back and transport us to, these were very new and very different designs. And so what were the elements of Halston's design that you really wanted to be able to bring to screen? And what was that journey of working with your costume team in having everything mapped out from scratch based on his original designs and patterns?
When Jeriana San Juan and I sat down and kind of set out to do this, you know, the thing that became really apparent as, you know, we laid out all the images of the collections and how we might, you know, checkerboard them into the show, it became really clear that Halston's designs are so iconoclastic and so timeless that they look like something you could wear right now. You know, you could be wearing a Halston sweater right now. You know, they're very forward thinking, and they're very minimal, and, you know, it's a kind of an elevated idea of sportswear. So the way that we made them look special was to contrast them with all the other people that populate this world. So Halston walks down the street, he sees these women in boucle Chanel suits, he sees rich hippie girls, he sees, you know, women in these, you know, Carnaby Street kind of 60s fashions, and another one in Pucci dress. And so you kind of get all these different textures and all these different, very busy, very diverse sort of outlooks on fashion. And then inside of Halston's world, it's very particular. And the thing that I think he's best known for is his minimalist aesthetic. You know, he took sportswear and elevated it to high fashion. Before Halston, it would be embarrassing for two women to be seen in the same dress at a party. And then Halston created the status dress, and everybody wanted to have the same outfit. So that was really fun. And Jeriana created something like over 1,400 costumes for this. You know, the Halstons were based on originals. Jeriana is an alumni of FIT in New York, the Fashion Institute of Technology, and was able to access the Halston archive there and really see the patterns. And she also went to different collectors of Halston. You know, the Halston pieces are very highly collectible, and she borrowed them and copied them, you know, so that she really had a sense of how they were structured. It was really important to me, you know, without having to say it, we all knew the show would live and die by these costumes.
And when you look at the costumes as well, it's not just about how they look on camera, particularly when we look at the runway scenes and the theatricality of that. It's also about the way that they really move with the actors, because there was a different essence in the display of clothes in those moments, and you really capture the essence of that in those scenes throughout the series. So how were the two of you really having that consciousness of not just what is this going to look like, but how is this going to move, and then choreographing and blocking out those scenes to really be able to lift that out on screen for us?
Yeah, it was a big process. We had to be really strategic about, you know, what shows we wanted to represent and how many pieces we were going to have from every show and what would have the most impact. And Jeriana worked very closely with Mark Ricker, our production designer, so that she had all of the samples and colors of the sets, and they were able to, between them, find costumes that would really come forward. The great thing is that Halston's, you know, interiors, which we were very, very meticulous about recreating, were made to show off the people. You know, they were made to show everybody to their best advantage, whether it was those incredible draped, you know, kind of Pasha's tent in the first episode, or the white on white in the second episode, and then the big Olympic Tower, which is all red carpets and mirrored walls and cityscapes. You know, and he was very particular about lighting and colors, you know, that were flattering to people.
One of the scenes that I always come back to in my mind with the show is that scene about halfway through the series where you have the whole slew of them, and they're all sitting in that office with all of the red around them, and then they're all dressed in black and red. And I think throughout the show, when you look at the color palette of it overall, you've really used color and structure to tell a story about the relationships between characters at different points. And so what are the ways in which you would think not just about what a character was wearing, but the way that you could use color in such a unique way to tell a story about, you know, a lot of the undercurrents and emotions and internal aspects of them as well?
Yeah, it was really clear when we started this that we would take our cues for the color palette from the show from Halston himself, because the story that we were telling is the story of this person's creative genius. And we needed to make it as appealing and as beautiful as possible, so that when they take that away from him, you really feel it. You feel the loss. So we just kind of took our cues off of Halston, and we tried to, as much as possible, to be authentic and really make the Halston models, Liza, Elsa, everybody stand out and look special, because that was the story we were telling. These are people who lived for the image. They lived for the silhouette.
Yeah. And when you look at your camera work throughout the show as well, it really feels very specific to the decades and the time periods that we're looking at, as well as how you want to aesthetically capture the way that you're telling the story. And so what was your journey of really mapping out what the camera motion was going to look like in a lot of the angles? Because even when you look at the pacing, it's not the same pacing that we tend to have in TV right now, which moves a lot faster. It kind of like slows everything down a little bit and kind of like takes us back to the time in that way.
The cinematographers and I really studied movies from the period. And in our process, it became clear we didn't want to imitate them. I didn't want there to be a kind of a, you know, ectochrome or some kind of a Kodachrome, you know, blur in front of between the audience and the characters. I wanted to feel like you were really there. And we just kind of took our cues off of the actors as much as possible. We were very prepared. We knew the way we wanted to tell the story. We knew, what lenses we wanted to use. We knew how we were going to move. And then the magic happens when the actors show up and they've also thought about it, and you turn them loose in these interiors. And that's what we ended up with. I was very, very pleased. It was a great synchronicity between, myself, the cinematographer, and the actors. And I think they felt very free.
And when you're taking us inside Studio 54, that must be such a unique challenge, because that is a space that we've seen represented in film and television before. And yet you still find a new way to really bring us into that space. And to, it's capturing the essence of the energy. It's capturing the connectivity that these characters have to that location, what it means for them, where they are in their trajectories narratively as well. So how were you thinking about the way in which you wanted to bring us inside Studio 54, and also very specifically how you wanted to use camera work to intonate all of those things?
Yeah, we wanted to express the excitement of studio for these characters, but it became really clear to me that after studying other, depictions of studio and nightclubs, there were bad ways to do it. And for me, the thing about going to a club is I might go to a club and have the greatest night of my life, and then another person would go that same night and have the worst night. So we wanted to make it subjective and create a feeling of expectation. And that's what we set out to do. I think the scenes at studio, we tried to make them as impressionistic as possible and make them more like feelings. And there's not a lot of story that moves through studio. It's a lot of excitement.
Yeah. Were you also constricted because of production constraints that were in place at the time? Because it wasn't necessarily something where you could have 200 extras in a room. And there's a multitude of scenes when you look at them in the show that perhaps could have had a lot more people in them, but would have faced those restrictions. And so how did you work around still trying to build that same sense of energy in a lot of these rooms, whether it's Liza performing or whether it's Studio 54?
Shooting during COVID was a big challenge. But the thing that we ended up doing in the theaters and in the Studio 54 scenes was tiling, which is where you do a shot and then you have everybody that's a background person that went into the room, and then you shoot it again with them in the middle, and you shoot it, and then it's all fused together. So we did a fair amount of that. And then as much as possible, I just put on my directorial hat and made the scenes in Versailles subjective to Halston. So we saw what Halston would see. And that's the way we went about it. It was very challenging, but it was really fun, and it was gratifying to be able to say that, wow, we really made that look great, with 48 people.
And throughout the show, you're really exploring the inner world of Halston, but so much about the different interpersonal relationships that he had. And we really get the opportunity to see the different sides of his personality that come out in these different relationships. His relationship with Liza, she's someone who kind of gently guides him, whereas Elsa's the person who will just say, it's not my job to buy a light bulb. This isn't what we're doing here. This is what we need to be focusing on. And then again, Victor brings out another completely different side and some different vulnerabilities within him. So when you Ryan and Ian were working on the episodes and working on the story arcs, how were you always thinking about the different inflections, the different vulnerabilities and emotions that you wanted to draw out of him through these individual relationships?
The complexity of the little family that Halston formed, of his creative peers, is based on real people. So it was really clear what roles they played. It's interesting, Joe was the kind of truth-telling, wisecracking sidekick, and he was his illustrator and worked very closely with him. And he was a peer. He was maybe a little bit older than Halston. And so we had his voice. We knew what that was. Liza has talked a lot on the record about her relationship with Halston. So we had a really good sense of their loyalty to each other and the way they supported each other. And that came very organically. And the Elsa Peretti of it all is it's like New York legend. They had this fiery, sort of unrequited romantic love, an incredible collaboration, but an incredible, incredibly tumultuous friendship and relationship. And Victor Hugo is like the court jester, in all accounts of him, he's the person that just will like throw a wrench into this, into the situation. And, he's a disruptor. And so it was really fun. And I feel really lucky that we had this ensemble. These people came to me after thinking a lot about it and were so prepared and like fully realized characters. They really, I really credit them for giving this a feel of New York in the 70s and 80s. They were so vivid.
And with your cast, the dedication that Ewan gives to all of his roles, and in particular with this one, is really monumental when you look at it. And I know that he also trained with a tailor and really wanted to learn exactly what it takes to construct a design and to actually make it by hand. Was that something that you helped to kind of like introduce him to and facilitate, or was that something that he just came up with and wanted to do off his own volition?
I think it was a little bit of both. It seemed to happen very naturally. We wanted to give him time to prepare, and he came about 3 weeks before we started. He started doing fittings for his costumes. He would hang out in the costume department with all the tailors and seamstresses and watch them work. And then Jeriana, our costume designer, would work with him and teach him how to make certain garments. And then we actually had Halston's personal tailor making his jackets and trousers. And that was incredible. I think Ewan got a lot from that, and then, he was so excited. He said, I can't wait. I used to be a smoker and I can't wait to go back to smoking. And then the cigarettes that we had were these terrible, I think they were some kind of a tea leaf cigarette. And he was just like turning green from all the smoking. And, it was incredible to watch his process because he picked up the dialect and developed the dialect over the course of the show. As I said, Halston sort of evolves in his mannerisms and the way he moves and the way he speaks. And that was fascinating to watch. He just did it so effortlessly. And he's such a generous actor. He really, brought up all of the younger actors and supported them in a really great way.
And with having Liza Minnelli as a character in the show as well, there's such a delicacy that comes with that because you're showing who she is on stage, but you're also showing the moments behind. And Krista does such a fantastic job at you don't feel like you're watching someone do an impression. You feel like you're learning so much about the undercurrent of who this woman was and is from the way that she brings it to life with such delicacy. And so I was very interested in how the two of you worked together in making a lot of the choices for her performance.
Krista and I workshopped that a bit. She came in and sang for me, which was incredible. And then, we worked on the dialect, and where we ended up and where we settled was on stage and in performance. We wanted to be as close as possible to Liza's patois and her patter on stage. And then when we were off stage and she's at home having dinner with Halston on the couch and hanging out, we thought it should just be Krista's voice. So that it was just, I didn't want that to be in the way of those dramatic scenes. And it worked perfectly.
And you talked earlier about, obviously there's a lot with Halston in terms of branding and figuring out his identity as a designer for public persona, but you also really explore a lot of the business side of what it means to be a creative, because nobody gets to be a creative 100% of the time. There's so many other aspects that come into it. And then there's also that battle about, when he doesn't want to make jeans for the mass markets because he feels like he's making a creative compromise. And you see that he just physically and emotionally can't bring himself to do that at a certain point. And so what are the ways in which you really wanted to give voice and conversation to that ideology behind creativity and the necessity of business that goes hand in hand with it?
Yeah, this is a really classic story of the collision of art and commerce. And it's a very rich story because, it's a story that's aspirational. Halston's a character who wants to be something more than the kid who grew up in the farm in Indiana. And so I think the compromises that he has to make to get what he wants is the thing that I think really gives this kind of energy and makes it propulsive. Is we've spent a lot of time setting up his genius and his sort of what's important to him, and what his work ethic is, and where he draws the line and his aspiration to be a couturier. And then we watch these corporations kind of gradually chip away at that until he's left without anything, and literally without the ability to create. And that's a very important story to tell. I think it's really unfair what happened to him. And I think it's also something we can all relate to. I mean, anybody who's had a job that's, had to compromise themselves in some way to get ahead.
Yeah. And you capture that really beautiful moment at the end of the series when it's that different type of freedom that he finds within himself when he just gets in a car and drives down the coast, and he no longer has to answer to anybody else or try to fight to be who he is. Was that something that you always envisioned as how you wanted to wrap up telling this story? Because it tells us everything about his journey in that one moment at the end in that scene.
I have to say, in all the iterations of this story, that's always been an important scene to me, because it's something that Halston really did. He spent his final years, while he was in declining health, taking these picnics and driving up and down the PCH and just kind of enjoying his life. And I think that's an important part of the resolution. I wanted to leave this. He's a tragic hero, and he literally rides off into the sunset. But I feel like that final episode, there's a kind of redemption for him. He starts off wanting to be an artist and a couturier, and he ends up actually being an artist and being a part of something bigger than himself. And that's really gratifying for me. And that was always an important part of the story for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to what we were talking about at the beginning with how this has been an over 20-year journey for you, and just how much personally you've put into yourself and how much time you've spent connected to Halston and all these relationships that you're showing us throughout the series. When you step back, what makes you feel really proud about what you've accomplished in the way that you've been able to tell this story on screen finally?
What's particularly gratifying for me is when people come forward and they say how much they loved it. There are people who were there that have come forward that said, oh my God, I felt like, he was in the room. Ryuen completely embodies the character of Halston. And then when younger people come to me and they say, I knew nothing about Halston. I spent all last night researching, the battle at Versailles. I spent all last week, going down a rabbit hole, learning everything I could about Elsa Peretti and her creations and her jewelry. That's really gratifying, because I think, this is as much as it's a story about aspiration and the American dream, it's also the story about this intense creative little family and a moment in New York history that'll maybe never happen again, where it all just came together like an art movement. And I think that really speaks to people, and that really is gratifying to me.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on everything with this series. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.